시청자 여러분 안녕하십니까? 한국경제TV 조연기자입니다. 글로벌 구루에게 듣는다 시간, 오늘은 테일러 존 측의 창시자 존테일러 스탠퍼드대 교수님 모시고 미 연준의 통화정책과 또 경제 위기를 진단해 보려고 합니다. 지난해 여름에 이어서 두 번째 인터뷰인데요. 당시에도 테일러 교수는 연준의 인플레이션 오판을 지적하고 한시라도 빨리 금리 인상이 필요하다 강조했던 기억이 납니다. 12월 FOMC와 그리고 적정 최종 금리 수준에 대한 전망도 들어보겠습니다. Hello, Professor Taylor. Thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you back.
It's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
먼저 12월 FOMC 전망으로 시작하겠습니다. 제롬 파월 의장의 발언을 보면 현재 0.5%포인트 인상이 유력해 보입니다. 교수님께서는 어떻게 보시는지, 또 인상폭 축소가 의미하는 바가 있을까요?
Well, I think there's been a lot of advertising and mentioning of the 0.5, 50 basis points. I think it would be better if they did 75, quite frankly, but it has to be done in a way that doesn't surprise the markets. And I think the Fed is still behind. They've been moving the rates up, and people have noticed that. But compared to the inflation rate, which by some measures 6% or so, the interest rate, which is barely 4%, below 4, is still quite low. So some adjustments are needed. As long as they're telegraphed and described well, I think it should work fine. So that's what I've been arguing for.
지난 여름 인터뷰 당시 교수님께서는 늦어도 연말부터 연준이 금리 인상을 시작해야 한다 이렇게 지적하셨습니다. 당시 또 인플레이션은 일시적이란 연준의 분석도 잘못됐다고 꼬집으셨죠. 지금 월가에서는 연준이 뒤늦게 대응을 하다 보니까 금리 인상폭도 커지고 경제를 망쳤다 이런 지적도 나오는데요. 어떻게 평가하시나요?
Well, I agree that they were behind and wrote many articles about that at the time and spoke to you at your show. And I think that they realized that they started to move and they moved a lot. And so people have noticed the recent move. But I think in some sense it's viewed as catch up. If they had done it earlier, as I and others have argued, it would be smoother. We would have the effects on inflation already. We probably would not have gone as high. But that's water over the dam, so to speak. We've already done that. So the question is how to make up for that, how to improve policy in a way which is not disruptive. We don't want disruptive for the U.S. economy or for the world economy, for that matter. So I think that's the question, and that there will have to be some tightening, in my view, unless we really luck out in terms of the inflation rate. And I think that's the thing that should be focused on now.
이제 시장의 관심은 연준의 다음 결정입니다. 내년 2월 FOMC 역시 빅스텝일지, 또 최종 금리 수준은 어디까지 오를지 궁금해하는데요. 최종 금리에 대한 월가 예상치 평균은 5.25% 수준이지만 일각에서는 6%, 또 최대 9%까지 보고 있습니다. 또 최근에 매파로 잘 알려진 제임스 블라드 세인트루이스 연은 총재가 테일러 존 측에 의거해서 5에서 7% 금리 수준을 주장했는데 교수님께서는 어떻게 보십니까?
Well, let me say, in retrospect, it would be better if they had moved earlier. And maybe they wouldn't have had to move so high. You know, inflation picked up a lot in the last year and a half in the U.S. It got as high as 8%, maybe 9%, depending on how you measure it. So I don't think that would have happened in the case. Now, there's still people who argue they should go higher than 4%, even 4.5%. And if you plug in, you mentioned the so-called Taylor rule, you plug in the Taylor rule, it says the interest rate should be 5-6%. So I hope they move in that direction. I'm not sure they will, but that's really the question. And I think it could even be higher. I think what is important now is that the Fed indicates that they will have to go higher with the interest rate if inflation doesn't come down. Then that will begin to have the impact on inflation. This is not as bad for the United States as it was in the 70s. The 70s, it took maybe a dozen years before inflation got so high. Now it's like 18 to 12 months. I've never seen so much attention paid to the Taylor rule because they're so far off, and that's what happens when you're off. The Taylor rule says the interest rate should be higher because inflation is higher. And so that's why all these people are suggesting 5, 7, 5.75, 8, or even 9%. And that is something that the Fed needs to take into account. You know, we think that monetary policy is done better if it's predictable, if people understand it, they know the strategy, And to some extent, these rules, this is when we're talking about one which has influenced opinion about like now, is saying, look, if inflation doesn't come down, you got to raise rates. And you got to even raise rates with inflation where it is. But telegraph that. It's going to be a better economy if it's telegraphed. And I think that's the key. That's the thing that's forgotten in many of the conversations we've had. Or if inflation starts to come down. And we're hoping that if it's a deliberative statement, look, the Fed will say, Jay Powell and his colleagues will say, we need to raise rates enough to bring inflation down, and people will realize, well, they mean business. They're going to have to make the change. And then the advantage of that, of course, you're telegraphing to the rest of the world, to other central banks about what to do, and that helps with the economy being smoother. So this helps us understand more and more about the importance of a strategy or a rule or a systematic approach to monetary policy.
월가 일각에서는 더 큰 경기 침체를 막기 위한 연준의 움직임이 필요하다는 주장도 나옵니다. 피봇에 대한 교수님의 견해는 어떤지 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
All these questions, it depends on what happens to the inflation rate. If inflation starts to come down, then they can lower the interest rate. If inflation doesn't come down, they have to raise the interest rate. That's the idea of a strategy or a rule. We're trying to deal with inflation. If inflation is higher, you have to have a higher interest rate. Inflation is lower. And so all your questions, not all of them, of course, but some of them are directed to what should the rate be? And my response, it depends on what the inflation rate is. I believe that if the Fed is deliberative, says this is the strategy that's worked in the past, this is what we have been successful at, then people will realize, well, inflation will come down if they do this. Inflation will not come down if they don't, and if it comes down, it's a good thing, and so they will not have to raise the rate so high. So I frequently say 6% is a number to aim for. It might be less than that if we're lucky, it may be more than that if we're not.
일각에서는 연준의 인플레이션 목표를 수정해야 한다 이런 지적도 있습니다. 인플레이션 2%가 더 이상 가능하지 않은 시대라는 건데요. 러시아 우크라이나 이슈도 여전하고 또 공급망 문제도 남아 있습니다. 교수님께서는 인플레이션 목표 수정에 대해서는 어떻게 생각하십니까?
I think that would be a mistake. I really do. It took a long time for the Fed to think about 2%. It really began in Asia, New Zealand. But it's been endorsed by many central bank chairs, by many other people, and it's not zero, it's not 1, it's 2, and so it's already built in some bias, if you like, some wiggle room, and so but to raise it to 3, 4 is really defeating the whole purpose of a credible policy which people can understand, because if it's raised to 3 or 4, well, maybe it'll raise to a 5 or 6. So this 2, well, maybe it's not perfect, maybe it should be 1.5. Is it a way to communicate, hey, it's too high, the world will work better if it's 2, and we'll aim for that. We'll do what it takes to get to that level.
이 같은 미국의 높은 기준금리가 다른 글로벌 국가들에게 또 특히 한국을 비롯한 신흥국에게 미칠 영향에 대해서는 어떻게 진단하시나요?
So this is one of the biggest questions to answer because inflation has picked up in emerging markets. To some extent, the Korean Central Bank, the Bank of Korea, has already made efforts along these lines to control it. But in Europe, inflation is 9%, and they still have a very, very low interest rate. So they're just beginning to make the change. And I think this is reflecting the fact that there's a relationship between countries' interest rates, and to some extent, that's because of the exchange rate. If the Fed has a higher interest rate, other central banks will have to raise the rate if they don't want their currency to depreciate. So I think that's what's happened to some extent, but it's not. I don't think it's enough. I think the Fed has to lead at this point, not in the sense of an absolute basis, but because inflation is high here. But inflation has not disappeared in the rest of the world, and so this has to be a philosophy of view which is different from each country, but the common denominator, the common thing is that if inflation's picking up, then the interest rate has to be raised. There has to be some reaction to that. If it's not, then inflation will keep going up, and that's not what we want. It'll be a terrible situation.
한국은행은 올해 기준금리를 6차례 연속 인상했습니다. 내년 전망을 두고 이제 미국과의 금리 차보다 국내 경제 요인에 더 집중해야 한다, 이런 주장이 나오고 있는데요. 실제로 가장 최근 금리 인상은 0.25%포인트 그치면서 속도 조절로 무게추가 기울었다는 시각도 나옵니다. 교수님께서는 어떤 조언을 갖고 계실까요?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that what works best if each country has an inflation target and they raise their rates or lower their rates to keep the inflation rate close to that target. And I think the fact that the Bank of Korea has increased the interest rates already by 6 times, as you say, is a step in the right direction. I think it may require more than that, but the main thing is it's important to have a lower inflation rate in Korea. It's important to have a lower inflation rate in every country. And to some extent, that can be achieved by Korea, Bank of Korea taking the right actions. Not all countries have independent central banks. In Europe, of course, there's a European Central Bank, which includes Germany and France and Italy, etc. So there's independence with respect to the central banks now. But what I think we have to be sure is that in that context, that there's an effort to pay attention to the inflation rate. So in some sense, the answer to your question is correct. Economic factors domestically should be the driving force. And I think that's what Bank of Korea is trying to do. There's exchange rate effects. If they get behind, there'll be exchange rate depreciation in Korea, and that's not something that helps inflation, hurts inflation.
최근 교수님께서는 인플레이션에 대한 가장 큰 오해는 금리 정책이 인플레이션의 주요한 원인이라는 것을 깨닫지 못하는 것이다, 이런 논문을 쓰셨습니다. 더 자세한 설명을 부탁드려도 될까요?
Yeah, this is a very important question. So in the U.S. And in other countries, but we focus on the U.S. now, people pointed to supply side things. Maybe the conflict in Ukraine and Russia raises gasoline prices, raises oil prices, or sometimes they pointed to the ships not blocking, but backed up in various harbors. And so that's the supply side. So whenever inflation picks up, this has always been the case. There's a focus on these other things besides monetary policy. And I think that's a temptation. It's easy to point to. It's easy to point to supply shortages. But the truth is, this is something you can show the monetary policy has been very easy in the sense that rates have been low until recently. You can point to the inflation picking it up about the same time. And it's not rocket science in the sense that it's precise, but it's pretty close. And I think that's the thing that people have to learn. Yes, there's always possibilities as other things, but this seems to be, all the evidence seems to be pointing to the fact this is a monetary issue.
내년 미국 경제 전망을 여쭤보겠습니다. 과거 글로벌 금융위기 같은 큰 경기 침체가 올 수 있다고 보시는지, 그리고 가장 중요한 리스크 또 변수는 무엇이라고 보십니까?
So it's a very good question, and it's on a lot of people's minds. I think that we can avoid certainly a serious recession, and I hope we do. I hope the Fed does the right thing. And they do this by realizing that inflation pickup is just a year and a half. It's not 15 years. It's relatively recent. So there's a real possibility of reducing the inflation by just indicating we will have higher interest rates unless inflation comes down, and that'll automatically bring about a lowering of wage demands, lowering of prices. And so sometimes it's called forward-looking, sometimes it's called policy rules, sometimes it's called strategy. But the more that the central bank, and not just the Fed, other central banks as well, can telegraph as best they can what they plan to do, the more likely it will be we'll have a reduction of inflation without this terrible recession that people are thinking about. And I think the risks are we don't achieve that. There's controversy, there's political aspects of it, but I think that's the direction we can hope for. And it will happen if they make the right decisions.
개인적인 질문입니다만 교수님께서는 어떻게 투자를 하시는지 궁금합니다. 자산을 운용하는 데 갖고 계신 철학이랄까요? 고려하시거나 또는 투자에 있어서 중요하게 생각하시는 부분들이 있을까요?
Well, that's a good question. It's everybody has to face up to this, and I tend to think equities are make sure you have a good part of your portfolio in equities, and you want to avoid risks. There's a risk of a recession, which is there, that's for sure. I don't think it will come out if the policy is correct. But I think that to some extent, look for equities. That's the long run benefits. And Interest rates will probably come up a little bit, but and they've been very low for a long time. But I think if you think what is the normal federal funds rate, the normal short-term rate, maybe it's close to 3%, not 4%, or 2.5%, not 1.5%. And so keep that in mind, and then build out longer rates on that basis. But then the stock market depends on continued success of the economies of Korea and of the United States and other parts of the world. And that's the thing to focus on. And so I tend to think of equities as an important place to have a good fraction of your wealth.
지금까지 존테일러 교수와 미국의 적정 금리 그리고 경제 전망에 대해 이야기 나눠봤습니다. 시청해주신 여러분 고맙습니다. John, thank you for being with us today.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it. Thank you for the good questions.